I'm going to turn the mic over to Ted.
Thank you very much, Susan. Thank you. Thank you all for coming up tonight. What a great facility this is.
Yeah.
We got a bocce court out there and everything. This is great. You know, this is my third visit to Lunenburg in the last couple of years. Yes! Was anybody at two of my earlier visits to the library over there? Yeah? Oh, a few. That's good. That's good. Not enough, but that's good. And thank you for coming out tonight. I got a lot of competition tonight, right? You got the Bruins playing. Actually, you got everybody playing. So great. But I'll get you out of here end of the first period. I promise. But thank you all. Thank you for coming out tonight. So tonight,
Our doors don't lock at 8 o'clock.
it's an inside joke. Thank you for coming out tonight. So tonight I'm going to be talking to you about my first book, neither of which I don't believe, I've had a chance to speak to. So you were the first group in Lunenburg getting to hear my first book. So it's kind of like that movie Memento. We're going backward in time. But in some ways it's my favorite book that I've written because it is all about my favorite people and one of my favorite places, other than Lunenburg, that I'm going to share with you tonight. So people often ask me over the years if I have a favorite story. You know, I've done hundreds and hundreds of stories for Chronicle over 25 years, and people ask me, so do you have a favorite story? And I'm always delighted, you know, many, you can assume, but I'm delighted always that I can say that I do have a favorite story of all time, and I can sum it up with a 4-letter word. It's okay. It's okay. F-R-E-D. Anybody ever hear of Fred Tuttle? No? Yeah? One or two? Yeah. Now, if I was asking that question in Enosburg Falls or Montpelier or St. Johnsbury, Vermont, it would be as if everybody, it would be silly to ask, because it would be like asking, does everybody know your favorite uncle or grandfather? Because really, that's what Fred Tuttle represents to a whole generation of Vermonters. Fred Tuttle is Vermont's most famous former dairy farmer. Now, that may not sound like a whole hell of a lot here in Lunenburg, which, let's face it, has some cows, but it's not Wisconsin, right? But, you know, Vermont is a state that counted more cows than people until the 1960s. So that's kind of a big deal. He's Vermont's most beloved folk hero. And that's partly, I should say mostly, because Fred Tuttle is also, I think, arguably America's most unlikely movie star. No? You're not buying it? No? Does he look like a movie star? No? Well, you know, I guess if he was in full makeup and full costume. Actually, speaking of costumes, that must have been a particularly cool day, okay, in Tunbridge, Vermont, because Fred seems to have put on that maroon quilted jacket. I saw Fred in all 4 seasons of the year, and I never saw him wear anything more than what he's wearing right there, even in the depths of a Vermont winter. Never saw him wearing a scarf or a warmer hat or a pair of gloves or any boots. The hat was Fred's calling card, you can imagine. You know, I think the reason why Fred liked that hat was because it gave him a certain peace of mind, okay? Because, well, we're all of a certain generation here. You may recall that there was a time before hotels had the card keys, right? There was a time when hotels and motels had these big green keys, and it said on them, if lost, drop in the mail, right? And it would be, I think that was the principle for Fred behind that hat. He could forget it anywhere, and it would get back to him. But this is like pretty much what he always wore. So you may be wondering, where does the movie star thing come in, right? So it turns out it doesn't matter whether you're in Tunbridge, Vermont, or Hollywood, California. It still comes down to who you know when it comes to the movies. And in Fred's case, it came down to his knowing his next-door neighbor, John O'Brien. This is John O'Brien posing with Fred the tractor, which is kind of fitting because John grew up next door to Fred's dairy farm. John O'Brien. The O'Briens owned a sheep farm in Tunbridge up there in the high pasture land of the Green Mountains. And as a little boy, he would wander over and walk around Fred's dairy farm and the cows and so forth, which obviously are a lot more fun to play with than sheep. And he would, when he was in high school, Fred put him to work, driving the tractor. And then John grew up, went off to college, smart guy, went to Harvard. And when he was at Harvard, he took up studies. Harvard University, in spite of its world reputation for education, does not offer a film major, right? That happens to be John O'Brien's passion. He has an interest and has made a career now in a very particular kind of movie making. Okay? He calls it community cinema. So it sounds like community theater, and it's the same principle. It's very unique, very different. I've never heard of anybody else doing it anywhere. What John O'Brien likes to do is he likes to craft a movie, a story, around something that an actual town, place, is living through, right? It might be a story involving, somebody helping out a neighbor. It might be a story about how a town came together to prevent a big development or something. But then he writes a movie about it, and then he has all the local people play themselves in this story, right? Yeah, you can imagine it's kind of cheap to do it this way, too. But you're not bringing in any big, high-priced Hollywood movie stars. But so this is what John went off to college, and then he came back to Tunbridge when he graduated college. And at that point, he found his neighbor Fred was in very different circumstances than when he had left. Even when he had left, Fred was already now in his 70s. But when he came back, Fred was not doing so well. Fred had a whole host of health problems. He was in his mid-70s at that point, but he had spent a lifetime, really, since he was 13 years old, running a dairy farm. And he had two bad hips, had terrible arthritis in two hips. He had a couple of bad knees. He had a bad heart, he had bad eyesight, he had bad hearing. Other than that, he was an Adonis. But he was, and he had his own 93-year-old dad living with him with his own health problems. So, geez, right? That's a lot to have to deal with. So this is what John came back to. This is what John came back to renew acquaintances with his neighbor, Fred Tuttle. And at this point, Fred was no longer able, because of all these health problems and so forth, was no longer able to farm. It broke his heart. It broke his heart in many ways. First of all, it was the only job he knew how to do. It was the only job he ever had. He was a dropout in the 7th grade. Only left Tunbridge to fight in World War II. Went over to Europe, and that was his sole trip out of Tunbridge, Vermont. And when he ran the farm, and then by the time he got to his mid-70s with all these health problems, he was no longer able to farm, simply physically could not do it. And he had to sell off his beloved herd of Jersey cows. He said it broke his heart. He said it was like selling off his own children. And this is what John O'Brien came back to see his friend Fred now in such sort of difficult circumstances. And, John couldn't give Fred what he needed, really was a job, because he now couldn't do the one job that he was skilled to do. He needed money. I mean, he had, just from his health expenses alone, and his dad's, he desperately needed a job. Guy's 75 years old, his only farm, that's the only thing he's ever done. So this was a difficult situation. And John, kind of took all this in and realized that while he couldn't find or offer his friend Fred a job, he could do something else, which was that he wanted to draw attention to the fact that his friend Fred, this former dairy farmer, was no longer able to do the one job that he was able to do. This proud, iconic American farmer, and was no longer able to farm. He didn't want to take any public assistance. He wanted to make money, but how could he find a job? So John decided to do what he was skilled to do, which was to write a movie about this proud American farmer who could no longer farm. So he knew that Fred in putting together this story. He knew his neighbor Fred was a broken-down farmer with a broken-down barn who desperately needed a job. It had to be a certain, there were certain limitations on the job and certain other things that he needed from the job, right? Guy's 75, he needs a job that doesn't require a lot of heavy lifting. He needs a job that doesn't require any formal education. As I said, Fred dropped out of 7th grade. He needed a job that paid pretty well, right? Because he had all these expenses. And more than anything, he needed a job that came with excellent health care. So John O'Brien thought of the perfect job in this movie for his friend Fred Tuttle. All Fred had to do was get elected to Congress.
Not a lot of heavy lifting lately, and I came in on that.
So he did. He did. He crafted a screenplay called Man with a Plan, and it was a real thing. Here it is in my hand. He crafted a movie called Man with a Plan about a broken-down Vermont dairy farmer with a broken-down barn who runs for Congress because he feels like it's the only job that he's qualified to get, that he could get, and that will give him what he needs. No highfalutin political platform, right? And in the movie, Fred played himself, a broken-down Vermont dairy farmer with a broken-down barn who runs for Congress. By the way, I told you, John O'Brien, Harvard guy, right? Bright guy, right? In the movie, where Fred Tuttle, the Vermont dairy farmer, is running for Congress, John O'Brien came up with the best campaign slogan I've ever heard, right? So, broken-down Vermont dairy farmer, running for Congress, his campaign slogan was, "I've spent my whole life in the barn. Now I just want to spend a little time in the house." Right? Somebody's got to run on that someday. Right? Isn't that beautiful? And in the movie, Fred Tuttle won. Fred Tuttle goes to Washington. Right? Fred Tuttle goes to Washington. Mr. Tuttle goes to Washington. And the movie was a hit. I am not kidding. This is in DVD. It first came out on VHS, right? And the movie was a hit. It became the highest-grossing independent film in Vermont state history. It played down here in Boston. The Independent was an independent film, and it played at Kendall Square, in Cambridge. And it was a hit. And it was like the feel-good movie of the early 1990s, and it made Fred Tuttle a folk hero. That is not photoshopped. Okay? Fred Tuttle was everywhere. He was on Leno when there was a Leno. He was on with Conan O'Brien. Fred Herman Tuttle tooling around Beverly Hills. What do you know? Right. And it was great. And it was great. And everybody was loving it. And everybody was having a good time. And I went to my boss and I said, "Do you see what is going on with Fred Tuttle?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "I got to go up and do a couple of more stories." And so I went back up to Tunbridge. And now Fred reached the next chapter, which was even more unlikely than the first chapter. And there'll be a third chapter. So at this point, movie comes out in 1995. Okay? All this buzz, all this success. Fred's all over TV. And then, as happens with a movie or a book, things begin to die down, And about 3 years later, John O'Brien and Fred were, they were feeling like, geez, I wish there was some way to recapture some of that excitement, some of that buzz. And now we're in 1998. 1998 was an election year. See where this is going? So John O'Brien, bright guy, Harvard guy, right? He had a brilliant, kind of a diabolically brilliant idea. They thought, it's an election year. The state senior senator, Democrat Patrick Leahy, is running for re-election. They thought, we've already run Fred in fantasy, in a movie. We know how to do that. What if we did it for real? What if we ran Fred Tuttle as a real candidate in a real election against a real opponent They thought it sounded kind of good. Neither of them wanted to defeat Patrick Leahy, by the way. They both liked Pat Leahy. And Pat Leahy liked John and Fred. So it was like, well, you guys do what you got to do. And they took out nomination papers for Fred Tuttle to run as the Republican nominee for the United States Senate against Pat Leahy. So far, so good. Now, being a kind of a political junkie that I am, I could have told Pat and Fred at that point, you have no idea what might happen. I know this sounds like a fun little lark right now, but you don't know what will happen. Because the history of American politics is filled with unexpected outcomes. People get elected president. So they took out nomination papers. So far, so good, except first unexpected outcome happens almost immediately. And that is that Fred Tuttle unexpectedly had a primary opponent. That was not supposed to happen. That was not supposed to happen. Jack McMullen. Jack McMullen was a wealthy Massachusetts businessman who the year before had retired to southern Vermont because I think he had hoped to maybe establish a little bit of a beachhead in Vermont state politics, and make his way in Vermont state politics. So he didn't expect to have an opponent either, and neither did Fred. But nonetheless, there they were. And now, they had to have a debate. Oh, you have no idea. So, on top of everything else, Fred Tuttle was not a public speaker. I know how many of you remember the late, great, and my dear friend Tom Menino, the former mayor. Right. Who would be the first to tell you he was not a fancy talker. Right. Well, compared to Tom Menino sounded like Winston Churchill. It was said that when Fred Tuttle merely said his name, it sounded like he was saying, I'm a furry turtle. Right? It came out kind of like, I'm Fredo! But they had to have a debate. And so Jack McMullen's campaign asked for 3 debates, to which John O'Brien said, are you high? So, verbatim. But they did have to settle for 1. So they did. Now, I don't know how many of you like politics like I do. Maybe I shouldn't admit that. But I love politics. And I love political debates. I love attending them. I love watching them. I love reading transcripts of them. There is a short sequence in the debate that took place between Fred Tuttle and Jack McMullen that is my favorite exchange in the history of American political debate. Granted, I haven't read all of Lincoln Douglas, but I think you will see what I'm talking about. So this took place in late October, 1998. Late October, I'm sorry. The election was in early November, so this was the last week of October. 1998, at the offices of Vermont Public Radio in Burlington, Vermont. This is a verbatim exchange between Jack McMullen and Fred Tuttle. And I think you'll see what I'm talking about. Fred, this is a milk production question, Jack. How many teats does a Holstein have and how many teats does a Jersey have? McMullen. How many? What, Fred? Fred. Teats, Jack, teats. How many teats does a damn cow have? As we've already established, we may not be in Dairyland here, but I'm willing to admit that a majority of you in this room know that the answer to that question, whether the cow is a Holstein, a Jersey, whether it's in Vermont, Wisconsin, or the planet Neptune, the answer nonetheless, always, everywhere, is boa teats. Jack McMullen did not know that. Let me tell you something. If you are running
for the Senate in Vermont. Okay? And you don't know how many teats a cow has? That's like running for mayor of Detroit and not knowing how many wheels a car has. Okay? It's not going to work. And it didn't. And on election day, primary day, 1998, Fred Herman Tuttle secured the official Republican nomination for the United States Senate. Then it got weirder. So now I went back to my boss and I said, Chris, did you see what happened last night in Vermont? He said, it's unbelievable. I said, I got to go up and spend a day on the campaign trail with Fred. What do you think? He said, how soon can you get up there? 8 o'clock the next morning, 24 hours later, I was back in Tunbridge. And I went around the side door of the Tuttle home, because I know they don't answer the front door, and I knocked on the door, and Dottie Tuttle, Fred's second wife, came to the door. How can I describe Dottie? Dottie is a colorful woman. You know, I grew up, 4 kids, 2 brothers, played sports all my life. I guess what I'm trying to say is, I've been in lots of locker rooms, and I'm no stranger to salty language. Okay? Dottie Tuttle knew words I never heard of. And they made me blush. Okay? So, she answered the door and I said, Dottie, what is going on with this Senate thing? And she said, first words out of her mouth, well, I ain't voting for him, that's for goddamn sure. She also threw another word in there, which I can't share. Okay? So nonetheless, we went off to the first campaign event of the day, which was at a little elementary school in Tunbridge, Vermont. So the day before, I'd gone up, the teacher of the elementary school, because I had called to get permission to come in there and shoot the Fred's visit. And she said, you know, I think that when you get up here, you should have a camera inside my classroom for when Fred walks in. And I thought to myself, everybody's a director. But when we got there, I realized why she thought that was a great idea. Because every single kid, so this was a 5th grade class, okay? So like 10, 11 years old, maybe 16, 17 boys and girls, right? And every single, what grade are you in? 4th? Almost. I thought you were 4th or 5th. So every single one of the kids in the class, including the teacher, in honor of their now famous neighbor, all of them were wearing Fred's trademark Carter's blue jean coveralls. But it wasn't just cute, it was hilarious, because these were all their parents' coveralls, okay? And these kids were this high. So what it looked like when they were walking around was a room full of headless farmers. Because they were all holding up the suspenders. It was the funniest thing I've ever seen. And Fred walked into the class, and just like that, he took his hat off his head, and he looked at the room, and he rubbed his stubbly chin, and he said, well, look at that. Why, Jesus, don't you know? And he sat down, and the kids had a Q&A with the Senate candidate. And they asked a lot of tough questions. In fact, they took a couple of my questions. They wanted to know what was his favorite pizza topping, what was his favorite ice cream flavor. So naturally, I thought, oh, great, now I have to look like a big shot reporter and ask an actual question. So I did. And I said, Fred, how much money have you guys spent in the campaign so far? And he turned to John and he said, John, what would you say? About $25? So the kids went out to recess, and then we had our big sit-down, one-on-one with the candidate. And I said to Fred, Fred, I know this is a lot of fun. I know you're having a great time. I said, but I'll tell you something. There's still a lot of time before Election Day. Strange things can happen. You know, I said, what will happen if Election Day dawns, right, and you are elected to the Senate? And he did not miss a beat. First words out of him, I said, well, first thing, my wife will divorce me right off quick. Well, in the end,
Fred didn't put Dottie through any such ordeal. Actually, just before the end, a week before Election Day, Fred did something else that was unprecedented in the history of American politics. 1 week before Election Day, he officially endorsed his opponent, Pat Leahy. He said, I like Leahy. I said I'm sure he's going to win. So he endorsed Leahy, despite endorsing his opponent. On Election Day, November 6, 1998, Fred Tuttle got almost 24% of the vote. Pat Leahy has never lost an election. Never lost an election. He told me this was the biggest scare he's ever had. So election night, Pat Leahy called up Fred to congratulate him. And he called, as soon as the polls closed, he called at 8 o'clock and he got Dottie Tuttle on the phone. And she said to him, she said to Pat Leahy, United States Senator, Pat, he's sound asleep, I ain't waking him. So Senator Leahy called bright and early the next morning, farmer's time early, right, 5 a.m. And he got Fred on the phone and he said, Fred, congratulations, my friend. You ran a great campaign. And Fred said, Pat, thank God you won. And Leahy said, what, Fred? He said, because. He said, I had a dream last night that I won it. I've been hiding out in the barn so no one would find me. But they actually became wonderful friends in the wake of that campaign. Truthfully, Vermonters, are known for being, shall we say, flinty with money, right? They're not out to spend more money than they have to. And Pat Leahy is a perfect example. So when Fred endorsed him, Pat Leahy immediately shut down his campaign so as not to spend another cent, right? And instead, he suggested to Fred that they travel around the state together and visit schools and talk to school kids. And Fred said he would do it under one condition. He said, I don't want any of those aides. He said, if you drive, then I'll go. So Pat Leahy drove a big boat because Fred needed room in the back to put up his bad legs. So it was like driving Miss Daisy, And so they drove around, and there are still people in Vermont who remember this, not because of their speaking at schools, but because, how can I put this delicately? So at this point, Fred is in his late 70s. He's driving around, they're driving all over the state, and he needs to stop fairly frequently to use the facilities, even if there aren't facilities. So a lot of people still remember that they'd be driving up Route 100 or 89 and they'd see a big black car parked on the side of the highway and they'd be, God damn, that looks like Pat Leahy. Whoa, it is Pat Leahy. And there he was, helping out his friend, Fred Tuttle. And they actually became very close friends, and several years later, Fred went ahead and he broke one of his hips. And his poor wife Dottie at the same time broke one of her hands. So they couldn't do a whole heck of a lot for each other. And for about 3.5 weeks, Senator Pat Leahy would come back from Washington, and he would take a few days, and he, without any press knowing about it, without any aides, he and his wife would cook up a whole bunch of food, and they would drive down to Tunbridge and bring food and dinner for a couple of weeks to the Tuttles in Tupperware, the senator points out, so they could reheat it afterward. See? Very flinty, right? And, I want to read, I can keep talking to you about Fred Tuttle, but let me read to you just what Pat Leahy has to say about Fred Tuttle, his friend, Fred Tuttle. There he is. Because there's really nobody, I think, who's sort of described Fred in the same way as Pat Leahy. So this is Pat Leahy talking about his friend, Fred Tuttle. One night, Fred and I sat up till almost midnight talking. He told me his biggest regret was quitting school. He said he loved children, and he always told them, don't do what I done. Stay in school. I asked Leahy what he thinks the essence of Fred Tuttle's appeal was. Well, Vermonters heard him, and they knew he was what he was He was what you got when you looked at him. There was no guile whatsoever. He was nice. He was warm. There's a pause on the other end of the line. The easy, self-assured voice of the nation's second-most senior senator and chairman of the powerful Senate Judiciary Committee trails off for a moment. At one point, before he died, he continues, he told me that the last years of his life, riding around the state, meeting school kids, were the happiest years of his whole life. In 2003, at the age of 84, Fred Tuttle passed away at his home in Tunbridge, Vermont. And by Jesus, he was a good one. That's Fred Tuttle. Now, those of you who watch Chronicle regularly, and I know, I'm sure most of you do, except right now, you know that frequently Chronicle is about colorful, fascinating New Englanders like Fred Tuttle, and places with frequently a lot of food thrown in for rationalization. Now, this is one of my favorite places. I'm going to tell you about another one as we finish up, but it really has more to do with one of my favorite people. Anybody know who this is? Stockbridge. Absolutely. Anybody know who painted this? Norman Rockwell. And there's Norman Rockwell's studio in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, where he painted that painting. And there is Norman Rockwell at work in that studio while he is working in what is now the Norman Rockwell Museum. Anybody been there in Stockbridge? Yeah, great museum. About 10 years ago, more than that now. It was 2009. And I was about to set out to the Berkshires because I was going to do a story about 40th anniversary. The anniversary of one of my favorite films, not Man with a Plan, which is a favorite, but Alice's Restaurant. Right? Yeah. And I'm going to have an opportunity to visit with Arlo Guthrie and go out there. And when I was going out there, the Stockbridge Museum said, geez, you know, it's also our 40th anniversary, so as long as you're coming out here, why don't you come by and visit us? And but then I thought, oh, wait a minute. I said, you know what? I read something recently. I said, is Ray Gunn doing volunteer work with you now? And they said, he is. And I said, we'll be there. So, a lot of people don't know about Rockwell is that although he was a master illustrator, in his later years in Stockbridge, where he died, he spent the last almost 20 years of his life in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. In his later years, he turned a lot of his prodigious talents to dealing with some of America's social issues, which he had all been concerned about, but he hadn't done when he did, say, cover illustrations for Look magazine, Saturday Evening Post, right? So, in his later years, he did turn his attention. And in 1967, Life magazine was doing a special edition on race in America, right? And they came to Rockwell and they asked him if they could commission him to do the cover for this special edition on race in America. And he did. He created a painting called New Kids in the Neighborhood, which is one of my favorite Rockwell paintings. Again, if you know anything about Rockwell, you may know, and you may have heard, you may have read that almost everyone in every Rockwell painting that he ever did was a real person. He painted almost exclusively from real-life models. So everyone in this painting, including, as far as I know, the dog, was from Stockbridge, Massachusetts, including this young gentleman over here on the far left. Rockwell also liked to, whether you knew it or not, he liked to locate his paintings in a real place. This is Rockville, Illinois. Families of color moving in. And this was to go, although it was on the cover, it also went with a story inside this special edition about one facet of race in America, the integration of America's suburban communities. So families of color moving into Rockville. And this young gentleman here was 13 years old when he posed for Norman Rockwell. His name is Ray Gunn. W-R-A-Y-G-U-N-N. How great a name is Ray Gunn. I would have paid my parents to call me Ray Gunn. Right? But Ray Gunn got the name, and there weren't a lot of families of color in 1967, you can imagine. There aren't a lot today in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, but Ray Gunn's grandfather, Papa Gunn, was a friend of Norman Rockwell. They had become good friends, and they would share a drink at the end of the day and smoke their pipes. And I'm sure at one point Rockwell told him about this work he was working on, and there weren't a lot of families of color, and it made perfect sense, I'm sure, for Ray Gunn's grandfather to say, well, you know, my grandson Ray might be the perfect person for it. He's 13 years old, which is what you're looking for. And Ray Gunn was 13, and he posed for Norman Rockwell when he was 13 years old. We went back out there in 2009 to renew acquaintances with Ray Gunn, who was no longer 13, when we renewed acquaintances. And he was now giving tours at the Rockwell Museum. And, you know, what was funny is that I thought, oh, this is great. I had it all worked out in my mind. You know, that we will we'll set the camera and we'll hear him giving, you know, a tour and talk. And he'll talk about this painting and he'll blow people away because he'll point out, that's me in that painting. So we're standing there, we're rolling, and this leaf peeping tour from Ohio comes in, and he's talking all about the painting, mentioning every single detail you can imagine, never says he's in the painting. Finally he does, as they're moving away. He says, oh, by the way, that's me up there in the painting. People are like, whoa, wait a minute. But you know, when we went back outside afterward, I said to him, you know, Ray, not everybody is in a famous painting, you know? I said, how does it feel to come into work every day and walk by a world-famous painting by a world-famous artist, and you're in it? And he just looked at it, and it was right when he said it, right there. And he said, I don't know. He said, I guess I think there's some place in the world I'll always be 13. Right? Now, I want to finish. We talked about two of my favorite people, and now I want to finish with one of my favorite places. Anybody know where this is? You got Stockbridge. This is a little tougher. A little tougher because it looks like a lot of other places in New England. Part of the reason it looks like a lot of other places in New England is because that lighthouse design is very, very common. Okay? That's a short one. That's only 45 feet high. Boston Light, which is 125 feet high, is exactly the same design. They just added to it. It's the same design you see in Nobska, right, in Falmouth on the Cape, the Nubble, also in Maine, right? But that is a very common design. Doesn't look like a particularly dramatically different, so nobody knows where that is.
West Shore? Is that on Martha's
No,
Vineyard?
no, not on the vineyard.
It's in
No, it is in Maine. It is in Maine. I just gave that away, actually. I said it's also in Maine. It is in Maine. And it's one of my favorite places, not because of the lighthouse. Not because of the lighthouse. It actually is because of what's behind the lighthouse. It's Pemaquid Point. Is that what you were going to say?
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah, okay.
It's Pemaquid Point. Pemaquid Point. Pemaquid sits at the end of one of those little narrow finger peninsulas, you know, that stick out on the coast of Maine. I'm going to share with you my favorite factoid about New England, all time. Okay? And now you're free to use it and impress your friends the rest of your life, because it's a really good one. Okay? You know, Pemaquid sits at the end of one of those finger peninsulas, and they stick out all along the coast of Maine. And when you think about the ragged and rocky coast of Maine, if you start following up along, it doesn't get quite like that until you get up to, I would say, just south of Portland, Saco, Biddeford, and then it really starts winding in and out. All kinds of little inlets and harbors and peninsulas and islands. And it goes like that all the way up to Calais, all the way up to Eastport, right? Winding in and out. You know, if you fly north to Maine, down east, right? If you flew from Logan to Calais, let's say, it's only about 200 miles, right? Take you about less than 50 minutes, right? If you drive from Boston to Calais, take you about 9 hours, 8.5 hours, right? Because of winding in and out, in and out. So if you could magically straighten out that ragged and rocky coast of Maine, okay? Straighten it out like a twisted up piece of twine, bling, and just magically straighten it out. You know what you get? 3,000 miles. From Boston to LA, the coast of Maine. Isn't that amazing? Just that one state. That's how much it winds in and out. So Pemaquid sits at the end of one of those finger peninsulars, and it sticks out into Muscongas Bay. It's in Bristol, Maine. Mid-coast, right? So if you went up to, say, Brunswick, Thompson, right, and then you bang a hard right, and you'd follow that peninsula down to Muscongas Bay, about 20 miles, you'd reach the little town of Bristol, and you would see Pemmican Point. And as I said, it's not the lighthouse that has always drawn me there, right? And it's one of my favorite places. It might be my favorite place on the water in all of New England. And I grew up on the water. I grew up on Boston Harbor. I grew up in Winthrop, Mass, or as I like to refer to it, the charming little seaside town at the end of runway 27L. It's very noisy childhood. But nonetheless, it is what's behind the lighthouse. Because Pemmican Point, when you get down on the other side of the lighthouse, which we've established is kind of a common-looking lighthouse, there's nothing common about what it looks like down by the water in Pemmican Point. It is, in many ways, it is what I see in my mind's eye when I think about the ragged and rocky coast of Maine, right? It's like that picture could be there with that description, right? And the way that it kind of forms a horseshoe, you can't see to the left, you can't see to the right. In other words, you can't see north or south, you can only see straight out. Next stop, coast of Europe. And I have been there in all 4 seasons of the year. It is just that kind of place that's kind of hypnotic. And when I wrote the chapter on Pemmican, you don't need that cursor there. And when I wrote the chapter on Pemmican, I had to consult with one of my favorite Maineologists, Peter Mehegan. You remember Peter? Peter Mehegan, former anchor and reporter for Chronicle, really my mentor at Chronicle, drove his Chevy all over Maine. Right. Well, Peter Mehegan knows more about Maine than most Mainers. And a lot of Mainers who know Peter would be perfectly happy to admit that, right? He traveled all over Maine in 30-plus years, knows everything there is to know about Maine, so I had to seek him out. And, Pete and I, we used to love to talk. There were 2 things Pete and I loved to talk about at the office. One was the Red Sox, and the other was Maine. Mostly about Mainers' particular idiosyncrasies. Any Mainers here tonight? Yeah, where from? Bangor. Sure. Well, I think my friend from Bangor will not disagree with me when I say that Mainers, by and large, don't like to talk all that much to people from away. Am I right? Yeah. Flatlanders, right? Yeah, it's kind of like, Maine, another factor, Maine is the only state in America that borders only one other state. Right? I think if Maine had its way, it wouldn't border any other state. But that would make Maine Hawaii. So that wouldn't really work. So Pete and I, we love to talk about that. We love to talk about Mainers' idiosyncrasies because we love spending time in Maine. And when I did the book, Pete gave me some great stories about Pemmican. And then as we were getting off the phone, I said to him, Pete, all this time I've known you, all this time I've watched your stories from Maine, I've never asked you, what is your favorite anecdote from Maine? And he said, oh, Teddy, I don't know. He doesn't like to be put on the spot. He was like, I said, I don't know. Oh, he said, well, this is a good one. So he had just been, this is now 6-7 years ago, but he had just done his last on the road. And he said, well, this is a good one. This just happened. So Pete had friends, you can imagine, very friendly guy, loves to talk. And he had friends all over Maine, from top to bottom, east to west, in the middle of nowhere. Pete had friends all over Maine. And in all of his trips, if he had time, he loved, if he was nearby to somebody, he loved to drop in on somebody. So as he's telling me this story, he had just been up to Maine, and he had dropped in on a friend of his who was a lobsterman in Cundy's Harbor. Now, unlike Pemmican, which is not a protected harbor, Cundy's is a very protected harbor, and it's kind of like a classic little lobstering village in Maine. And so he had a friend there, and when he was by, he'd go in, and they'd go out, and they'd lobster for an hour or so, then they'd come back in, and they'd defrost, warm up over an adult beverage or 2 or 3. And so on this particular trip, he said he drove his car down to Cundy's because he wanted to drop in with this guy. And he said, as I'm driving down on the dock, I see the guy's son throwing some traps up on the dock, but I don't see his dad. So I thought, oh boy. So he drove up, and he got out of the car, and he walked over to his son, and he took his son's hand, and he said, is Dad okay? And his son said, Dad's fine, Pete. He's recuperating right now at my brother's down in Wexford. So it turns out his dad had just had eye surgery. It turns out his eyes had been failing for years. And as he explained to Pete, his doctor had begged him for years to have what's a relatively simple procedure called a vitrectomy. It simply tightens the viscous nerve in the eye.
And the guy was sure that it would help his patient, his eyesight, substantially improve, but stubborn old Mainer that he was, he just wouldn't do it. So as the son is relating the story to Pete, he said, well, he finally decided to do it. So he said he went home, and he said to his wife, he said, "Ma, pack a bag. We got to go down to Boston. We got to go to the Mass Eye and Ear. Don't ask me why. They want to give me a vasectomy." They say it's going to make me see better. And it did. So, as we were getting off the phone, I'll finish with this. So we're getting off the phone. And Pete was always one to turn the table. So he said, "Hey, Ted, what's your favorite Maine story? What about you?" And I thought for a minute, I thought, "Geez, Pete, I don't like your rides." But then I thought of something that was funny from my younger days because it goes right to our favorite Mainer idiosyncrasy, which is not liking to talk to people from away, right? From out of state. So when I was 20, the summer that I was 20 years old, which was in 1871. Feels that way. The summer that I was 20, I spent that summer on Mount Desert Island, right? Bahama. And I had a friend who I was working there that summer with, and we had a day off, right? And another friend of ours who we worked with, who had to work that day, but she had a car. So she said, "You guys want to use my car for the day?" And got off the island. And we were like, "Yeah." So we did. So her car broke down within 20 minutes. So we hadn't even gotten to the causeway to get off the island, which was really cruel because we could see it in the distance. So now we have to take the car back, find a way to get the car back down to Somersville on Mount Desert to see if we can get her car fixed, right? It's our responsibility. We have the car. So it's hot. It's like one of those, one of those days that really, by the water, even though you're by the water, right, it's really humid and the air's not moving, and it was like humid and 90 degrees, and we had to push this car. Now, it wasn't 1876, but it probably was like 1976, so it was not a Yugo, it was a boat. It was like a Ford Fairlane, right? So we're pushing this car, and I'm sitting for miles, we're pushing this car. So we're pushing and pushing, we're like, we got our shirts up now, we're dripping with sweat, and we're pushing the car, and finally, we see up ahead, almost like a mirage in the desert. It looked like a house coming into view. And sure enough, we keep pushing the car, and there's like a little white frame house. And as we get a little closer, we can see there's like a little old Mainer sitting on the porch of a little white frame house. Looked like something out of Winslow Homer, right? His dog is sitting with him. And finally, we got up to the house, and I said, "Excuse me." I said, "I saw a sign there, gas station. Do you know if there's a mechanic at the gas station?" And he said, "Yes, sir." And I said, "Thank you." And we kept pushing the car. I don't think we went another 10 yards when I heard a little voice behind me. "You won't find them today, though." No, we wouldn't. But we kept pushing the car. And we got there. And there was no one there, so we left a little sign on the windshield, a little post-it note thinking, what we auto-diagnosticians that we weren't thought the problem was. And we came back early the next morning, like about 7 o'clock. And the car was gone. We thought, great. So now our friend's car broke down and it's been stolen. But then, right then, we heard like some banging around. We heard some banging around inside the garage. So we looked inside the garage, and sure enough, our friend's car is up on the lift. Somebody's banging around under the hood of the car. I said, "Well, this is good." I said, "Excuse me. Hello?" Finally, this little head poked out from under the car. We recognized him immediately, our friend from the porch. Right, because, what kind of Mainer is going to share the details of your work schedule with a stranger? So, he figured out what the problem was. Turned out to be nothing. But he had it done in 15 minutes, right? Boom! Banged that car down off the lift, turned to us, wiping up his hands, and he said, "You boys have breakfast?" We said, "No." He said, "Come on.
And he went outside, he kicked open a side door, he went outside, there was a little old refrigerator out there. He kicked the door opened up, and he pulled out a couple of ice cold past blue ribbons. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. So, now you know what I eat for breakfast. But if anybody has a question or two, I'd be happy to take a question or two. Doesn't have to be about Maine, doesn't have to be about the book, doesn't have to be about anything. It could be about nothing. But anybody have a question? Anybody have a question? Don't make me sing feelings. Any questions? All right. So, in that case, we can move ahead to the next phase of the evening, which is a favorite of mine, which is when I sell books. So if there are no questions, I would be delighted to sign a book. If anybody, I have all of my books here with me tonight. I have my newest book, which I spoke about less than a year ago at the library around the corner, all about New England's general stores. And I have my second book, which is all about New England's most famous feuds, Wicked Pissed. And of course I have New England Notebook, where you can read a lot more detail about Fred Tuttle and my breakfast in Maine. So I will set up camp over here, and seriously, if anybody would like to buy a book, I would be delighted to sign one for you, whether you buy a book or not. I also have a sign-up sheet right here at this end of the table, so if you'd like to give me your email address, I would be happy to put you on my newsletter list, which is what I like to do. I don't send it out very often, but in a period starting now, where I'm starting to work on another book, I like as it gets closer to when it's coming out, I will use my newsletter list to sort of share a simple chapter with people before it's released, that kind of thing. So if you want to give me your email address, there's a 50-50 shot. You'll never hear from me again. I shouldn't say that. So I'll be right over here. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted. That was great. So, please talk to Ted.
There you go. Thank you, Susan. Susan doubles as my agent.